All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful daf ahead of us today, incredible daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av. To thank Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month in honor of Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson, who enable all of those outside of our physical Bais Midrash to be able to join in our Talmud Torah. To thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of Sergeant Nicholai Rappaport of the Givati Brigade, who died in a Hezbullah ambush in southern Lebanon on February 7th, 1998. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Michael and Leah Edidin, in memory of Leah's brother, Yehonosan ben Yosef, Zichron Lebracha, whose yahrzeit is on the 11th of Av. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Lav and Aliyah and the families a Nechama. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Aleph 71. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Ayin Amud Beis 70b, 15 lines up from the bottom. So also remember again, we're beginning with the line that says, Umi Amar Shmuel Haki. So remember again, both sides, we are actually coming in a little bit of a middle of a topic, right? Which is, the Mishnah told us that halacha l'maisa, if a person doesn't have das, person doesn't have mental capacity, so obviously they can't go ahead and instruct that a get be written. We also spoke about the case of where a person has capacity, issues instructions for the writing and delivery of a get, then loses capacity. So there we had a machlokes about what do we do? Do we just continue on? Do we wait ultimately again until the husband himself is Baruch Hashem okay? I said that was the machlokes that we saw between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. In the midst of all this, the Gemara actually brought up another discussion, and that's where we pick up today. Umi Amar Shmuel Haki. Did Shmuel actually say this? Now we'll say, what's the this? What's the this? In yesterday's daf, the Gemara quoted a statement from Shmuel that if halacha l'maisa, a person, Rahman al-Islam, shachad bo shnaim urov shnaim, has both the esophagus and the windpipe cut, so Shmuel said that halacha l'maisa, and he instructs, write a get for my wife, that you could write a get for such an individual. Now we'll say, now what that means is that in Shmuel's view, someone who has the windpipe and the esophagus cut is still alive, right? Still has the status of a living person, hence has the ability to instruct that a get be written for his wife. So the Gemara says, Umi Amar Shmuel Haki. Did Shmuel actually say this? The Gemara says, after all, V'hamra Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shachad bo shnayim or rov shnayim. If it, right, let's say somebody, Rahman al-Islam, has the esophagus and the windpipe cut, or the majority of those two things cut, Ubarach, and he runs away from in front of us, Mi'idin alov, we testify about him to allow his wife to remarry. Which is another way of saying that according to Shmuel, once a person has the esophagus and the windpipe cut, halachically, it's as if they're dead. Right? So even though, again, he ran away from us, we can testify that he is dead, so to speak, to allow his wife to remarry. Now, I will say, if you're dead, you can't instruct to have a get written for your wife. So which one is it? According to Shmuel, do we treat the person who has the majority of the simanim, right, the windpipe and the esophagus, do we treat him as already dead, or do we treat him as dying but still alive? And if you hold, like Shmuel said before, that such a person is considered to be living, how can you testify about him that he is dead so as to allow his wife to remarry? So to which the Gemara says, you're right. Amri chayhu b'sofo lamos. Now we'll say, essentially, what we say is, the answer is both. Obviously, at this point in time, the person is considered alive. But this is the type of injury that is irreversible and fatal. So this is the type of situation where, although the individual right now is halachically considered to be alive, we know that he is going to die. B'sofo lamos. We'll say there's a look at Rashi. Chayhu v'gito mechayim. So we'll say, so what's interesting about this, the Gemara seems to be suggesting over here, is you could play this a little bit both ways. So you have this individual, right? I'm not going to ascribe a name to it because it's such a terrible case. A certain individual, and his windpipe and esophagus are cut. So we'll say, so that is a terminal injury from which a person is not going to recover. There is no hope of survival from such an injury like this. At the moment, however, that he is still alive, he's considered living. And therefore, Allah Shmuel says if he instructs that a get be written for his wife, then what's the halacha? What's the halacha? We comply. That is a proper instruction. We can write a get for his wife. On the other hand, if he runs away, so we no longer know where he is or what happened to him, we feel confident testifying at some point in the future that he is dead. Right? Because again, that is an irreversible injury, that he is dead. And based on that, we would allow his wife to remarry, even though what to both say, we don't see a body in front of us. Right? We didn't see him die, but the nature of the injury is such that we feel confident going ahead and testifying that he's dead. Let's say it's actually also a little bit of it's a profound statement. The Gemara says, Chayhu v'sofo lamos. He's alive, but he's going to die. Let's say that pretty much describes, right, the nature of the human condition, which is something as Shlomo HaMelech says, V'hachai yitin el libo. Take that to heart. Take that to heart. Life is a finite, non-renewable resource. One day we all die. And the truth is, we do not know when we leave this world. And that phrase, Chayhu v'sof alamos rabosai, it sounds strange, but I think that phrase is a mantra for successful living. Because if I know at the end of the day that one day I leave this world, and I do not know when that day is, I hope that it is long, right, far, far away. But at the end of the day, we do not know when we are called back before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the greatest impetus to do whatever we have to do, and to do it now, to make the necessary changes. And I will say, it's very auspicious to learn this Gemara on Erev Tisha B'Av. But you should know the Sfarim bring down that there are 3 weeks, right? Obviously 3 weeks between Shavasar B'Tammuz, 17th of Tammuz, and the 9th of Av. So the Sfarim bring down that the 21 days of Bein HaMitzarim correspond to the 21 days of Yamim Noraim. There are 21 days from Rosh Hashanah until Hoshana Rabbah. 21 days, right? And Hoshana Rabbah, Chazal tell us, Gemara already tells us, is the end of Din. 21 days of Bein HaMitzarim, the 3 weeks, 21 days of Yamim Noraim. And the Sfarim bring down that there is an incredible power of cathartic change, an incredible power of tshuva, an incredible power of just turning things around during these days. And that power is most acute on Erev Tisha B'Av, going as a Tisha B'Av. It's interesting because we normally think of Tisha B'Av as a day of mourning, not necessarily as a day of change, but literally, again, the power and the koach of tshuva during this time of the year is palpable. So we'll say, we already know, again, we're veterans of the daf. So as veterans of the daf, we also know that there is no such thing, right, as just random or haphazard timing as when we learn certain Gemaras. So the notion that we learn this phrase, Chayhu v'sofo lamos. I'm alive now, but one day I won't be alive. So make the necessary changes, do the necessary things, and do it now. The fact that we're learning this Gemara Erev Tisha B'Av is an incredible gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if that's the case, that this person who has 2 of the simanim cut is considered to be fully alive right now, so we'll say, so the halacha should be that this. We'll say, listen to this case. Imagine for a moment, we'll call him Ruvain. Right? Ruvain has his windpipe and his safek is cut, right? And then I will say, then what happens? Shimon comes along and accidentally kills Ruvain. And I will say, Ruvain is having clearly a bad day, right? But Lamaisa again, so now Shimon accidentally kills him. So we'll say, what's the halacha for accidental bloodshed? What's the halacha? Galus. So if that's the case, Shimon should be sent to exile for accidentally killing Ruvain. Alama Tanya, but we learned Shachat Bo Shnaim O Rosh Shnaim Harei Ze Eino Gola. I will say, but yet the halacha is that if you kill someone who has the windpipe and his safek is cut, you actually don't go to exile for killing such an individual. Why? Rabbi say, why not? Because that person is considered to be dead already. So again, we're contradicting ourselves, right? Well, so in other words, if you tell me that he's alive enough to instruct someone to go ahead and write a get for his wife, but right, then halacha l'maisa, he's alive. If he's alive, then if you kill him accidentally, you should go to Galus. To which the Gemara says, Ha'itmar Allah, both say first wide line, bottom of Ayin Amadeis, Ha'itmar Allah, Amra Voshia, Chayshinan Shema Haruach Bilbalto, Inami, Hu Kirev Esmisaso. Should I say, here's the concern. The concern is, the reason you can't send someone to Galus, I will say, is because halacha l'maisa, we're concerned. Look, here's what everybody agrees with. When someone has the majority of the simanim cut, right? So the esophagus and lymphatic is cut, that is obviously fatal. The person is not going to recover. The person is going to die, right? But yet, the halacha is, if they instruct someone, write a get for my wife, what's the halacha? Valid instruction. What do you see from here? That ultimately, again, they are still considered to be alive. To which the Gemara says, you're right, they're alive. So why not go to Gullus if you accidentally kill them? And the answer is because the concern is, Rabbi, a person in that precarious situation could do something which hastens their death themselves. What's an example of that? So Rabbi, so one of it is haruach babalto. Apparently, a strong wind has the ability, which makes sense, since the esophagus and the windpipe are now exposed, a strong wind has the ability to hasten their death. Or also the other possibility is, if they twist and turn in the wrong way, that could also hasten their death. So the concern just is that if Reuven has this situation, that the two simanim are cut, Shimon comes along and, let's say, stabs him, right? Or whatever, that would be like, accidentally stabs him, right? I will say, so then halacha l'maisa, the reason we can't send Shimon to Gadlus is out of concern, is it really Shimon that killed Reuven? Or maybe again at that moment there was a wind, or Reuven himself turned in the wrong way, thereby essentially exacerbating his situation himself, and therefore his demise is due to his actions, not due to Shimon's. Okay, to which the Gemara says, my Bennett, by the way, the Gemara just says, apparently there are two things that could chas v'shalom cause a person's death, or hasten a person's death, in this situation where they have two of the simanim cut, either the wind, or ultimately again their own movements. So my Ben, I always try to go through these two approaches. Ika benau deshachte bevesei deshisha upirches. We'll say nafkamina could be where, let's say again, Shimon, let's say, goes ahead and stabs Reuven, or quote unquote kills Reuven in a house of marble. We'll say apparently a house of marble, there's no wind, so there wouldn't be a ruach, but pirches. But let's say it could be a case where Reuven himself moved. Inami deshachte bebara v'lo pirches, or Shimon went ahead and let's say stabbed Reuven in outside where there is wind, but ultimately again Reuven didn't move. Okay, fine. Shabbos say, so bottom line, the Gemara says as follows. Shabbos say, so bottom line, what we have over here is halacha l'maisa. The Rambam Paskins already mentioned this in yesterday's daf, but the Rambam Paskins like Rabbi Yochanan, namely, if husband issues directive to write get when he is of sound mind, great, and then we obviously execute. If he issues that directive when he's not of sound mind, we don't execute. What happens if he issues it when of sound mind, but then loses capacity before we've written the get? So we'll say, so the halacha is Rambam Paskins like Rabbi Yochanan, namely we will wait to write the get until he is healed. But once he is healed, we don't have to go back and check with him again, but we will wait to comply with his directive until he is of sound mind. Good. Let's go back to Nishtatek. So we'll say the Mishnah then dealt with the case of the husband who becomes mute. So what do we do in that case? We go ahead, so we'll say, so now he can't communicate, so what do? We ask him. Right? And as long as he's able to nod yes to the right questions, nod no to the right questions, ultimately again, that demonstrates capacity. To which the Gemara says, listen to this. V'leichosh dilma shichye delav lav nachte, ilav is shichye dehein hey nachte. Now let's say, how do you know just because he nods his head yes or nods his head no, that that's indicative of capacity? We'll say maybe he's been seized. Or we'll say literally again, shichya, Rashi says, is choli shal shigaon, hamalando tamid laharchin. We'll say maybe he's just like ill, right? In that he's always shaking his head yes, or always shaking his head no. In other words, how do you know that shaking your head indicates capacity or indicates mental capacity? To which the Gemara says, maybe he's just constantly shaking his head yes, constantly shaking his head no. We'll say, so no. What we do is we ask him questions at intervals. Right? So that's why, again, if he's always shaking his head, then we indicate that, of course, that indicates that that's not reflective of capacity. It's just, unfortunately, maybe he's got something else going on. So what we do is we ask a question or ask a series of questions, then stop. Ask more questions, then stop. And we see, again, is he nodding in response to the questions, or is he just stam nodding? Let's say still maybe, how do you know he just nods? Maybe he just nods his head at intervals. In other words, and maybe again, the timing of his intervals happens to coincide with the questions, but Lamaisa is not indicative of capacity. So this is interesting. The Havamina was that we're asking just like a whole bunch of yes questions, right? And then or maybe a whole bunch of no questions. To which the Gemara says, no. Essentially, what we do is we ask him one no question and 2 yes questions, and then 2 yes questions and 1 no question. In other words, by alternating, not just simply asking him questions, but yes and no answers. What that does is, I'll say again, is it's got to be reflective of capacity, right? Because obviously, if he's answering those questions correctly, that indicates that indeed he does have capacity. Rabbi Shmuel Tana. But so we ask him seasonally based questions, right? Because to answer seasonally based questions, you have to be able to go ahead and have das. So mind you, what's an example of a seasonally based question? So I'll say, if you ask him like during the summer, right, would you like a coat? Right? Would you like a coat? Or, during the winter, would you like a light blanket? To which the Gemara says, Dilma kura achde, ina michama achde. That's not really a fair question. I will say why? Because maybe a person has the chills during the summer and wants to wear a coat, or for that matter has a fever during the winter and wants a lighter blanket. So that's not necessarily indicative of das. Top of Ayin Aleph 71a, Ella Beperi. So we'll say it's interesting. Rather, what we do is we ask him questions regarding seasonal fruit, right? Now we'll say, obviously, you think to yourself, like, I don't know, like, what's a seasonal fruit? So we'll say, so again, in an agricultural society, also people I would think are much more in tune with these kind of things. Right? So you ask him, do you want a piece of watermelon, in February? So, and he says, sure. So I'll say, so obviously, again, that's a lack of das. But if you're able to ask him about winter fruit in winter, summer fruit in summer, and you mix it up a little bit, and he's able to answer all of that correctly, again, just through nodding, we'll say to be clear, this is a guy who can't speak. So if through nodding, he's able to answer correctly regarding seasonal fruit, that is indicative of das. Okay, incredible. So we'll say, Amrav Kana Amrav. So I'll say, so now very interesting sugya. So just to highlight what's happening over here, I will say is as follows. The chiddush that the Gemara is introducing to us is the following. Normally, in order to go ahead and give a get, what has to happen? There has to be a verbal directive. So you have a verbal directive, right? Kisvu utnu get leishti, an explicit verbal directive. And as we're going to see, an explicit verbal directive to the sofer, to the witnesses. Now what we've just been introduced to is, if the husband is unable to talk, right, he can give a non-verbal directive, assuming that we have ascertained that he has capacity. Right? So again, we ask him the seasonal fruit questions, right? Or I will say, by the way, you understand, it doesn't just have to be about seasonal fruit. Right? The idea is we ask him questions that indicate capacity, and as soon as he has capacity, he is able to indicate to us through nodding, or through non-verbal communication, that he wants the get to be written. Okay, so now we'll say based on Amrav Kana Rav. So we'll say second line from the top, Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph 71a. Amrav Kana Rav. So Rav Kana said the name of Rav. Cheresh shiachol ledar mitoch aksav. We'll say what happens if you have a cheresh who is able to communicate through writing. Kosvin v'nostin get leishto. So we'll say he could communicate to us through writing that he wants a get given to his wife. And halacha l'maisa, we could give her a get based on his written communication. And I will say, let's define the case here a little bit. Take a look at Rashi. Cheresh shahia pikeach. We're talking about someone, I will say, who was fully functioning at the time of his marriage. So shahia pikeach kishekinsa ukidushav kidushan gimurin utzam bivamis nischarishu o nishtata lo yotzi ulamis lefishin koach begirishei charashus lafkia kidushay chachma. V'kamarav dim yochol ledaber mitoch aksav deodea lichtov ala klaf kisvu utnu get leishti atem ploni uploni umaslam b'kiach gamer masalahem b'kiach gamer hu the kosim nosen. So we'll say this is a very specific case. Ruvain married Rachel. When Reuven married Rachel, ultimately, again, he was a fully functioning individual. Something happens over the course of marriage, and he loses his ability to speak. So I will say, by the way, it happens to a lot of husbands over the course of marriage, right? I just want to say, so again, he loses his ability to speak. So I will say, so what happens? So now what happens? Now he wants to divorce his wife. So I will say, so here's the issue. Because when he got married, he was fully functioning. Therefore, I will say, this is a proper kiddushin. So it could only be dissolved in a proper way with a husband who has das. The chiddush of Rav is, even though he cannot speak, if he could communicate in writing, ultimately, again, we could dissolve the marriage that way. All right? So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef, my kamash malon. So what's the chiddush over here? We learn this in the Mishnah. Tanina. Nishtatek va'amru lo nichtav get le'ishtecha. We'll say this is literally the case in the Mishnah. A husband becomes mute, right? And ultimately, again, we ask him, do you want us to write a get for your wife? Ve'hirchin barosho, and he nods to us. As long as both can also shlosha pamim, we check him 3 times for capacity. Im amra alav lav al hein hein. If he answers the yes/no questions properly, hare elu yichtavu v'yitnu. They could write a get on his behalf. So we already learned this in the Mishnah, that again, when the husband lacks the ability to speak, essentially what we do is we check for mental capacity, and if he has capacity, we go ahead and we write the get for him. Rabbi Zera ilaim ka'amrit. So I'll say, no, here's the difference of Osai. The Mishnah is talking about a case of an ilaim. We'll say, what's an ilaim? Ilaim is someone who is mute. Right? That's the Mishnah's case. The guy can't speak. Shiny ilaim. A mute person is different. Why? So we'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Ilaim kamret shiny ilaim, Rashi says, Techevon d'shomeahu hariu kipikech l'chol dvarav. Aval chilish she'enu shomea ve'enu medaber ilav diyochel ledaber mitoch atzab beremiza lo mapek. So we'll say, listen to this. The Gemara says there's a very big difference between an ilaim and a cheresh. We'll say, bepashtos, whenever we see cheresh in Gemara, cheresh almost always means deaf and mute. Here we're going to see the Gemara is actually using it first to speak about a person who is deaf. The Gemara says as follows. So when it comes to a mute person, I will say, a mute person in halacha is treated as a bardas. In other words, if you have the ability to hear, the assumption is you have full capacity. Just because a person is mute, they lack the ability to verbally communicate. But because we're confident they have das, we allow them or we recognize their communication through different means. Disanya, here we go, we'll say, Disanya, medaber ve'eno shomea, if a person is able to speak but unable to hear, zeu cheresh. So we'll say, so again, the initial definition of cheresh is someone who is deaf. Shomea ve'eno medaber, but a person who hears but is unable to speak, zeu ilaim. Ultimately, again, such a person is a mute. I will say this is actually a pretty dramatic statement, and both of them are considered to have full capacity in all areas. And I will point out over here, Rashi says, remember again, here the Gemara is defining a cheresh as someone who speaks but doesn't hear. Someone who's deaf. Rashi says, so we'll say, so just to be clear, Rashi says, cheresh that we normally talk about, right? Remember again, who is the cheresh normally grouped with? Who is he grouped with? Shota and a katan. Rashi says that is a deaf mute. Here the fact that the Gemara is defining cheresh as someone who's deaf, this is not the typical definition. Okay. Umimai, the medaber ve'eno shomea zeu cheresh, shomea ve'eno medaber zeu ilaim. We'll say, how do you know which definition is which? In other words, why is it that a deaf person is called a cheresh and a mute person is called an ilaim? Dichsiv, because it quotes the pasuk over here, Tehillim, va'ani kecheresh lo eshma, u'ki'ilim lo yiftach piv. Okay, this is pretty explicit. David HaMelech says, I am like a cheresh who cannot hear. So you see from here that a cheresh is someone who is deaf. U'ki'ilim, and someone who is mute, ultimately again, lo yiftach piv, cannot open up his mouth. And she has people say, Ishtakil milule. So we'll say it's interesting that the word ilaim may actually be a contraction of meaning what? Ishtakil milule, which means someone whose words were taken. Okay? I'm Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Zera says, Ikashili, hakashili. If I have a question, here is my question. Desanyo, Imlo yagid prat le'ilim shenei yochel hagid. We'll say there is a halacha. Torah says that if someone knows testimony on behalf of someone else and does not share that testimony, there's culpability for withholding testimony. Okay, so the Gemara says, the pasuk says, "Lo yagid v'nasa avono." If he doesn't share his testimony, ultimately again he will bear his sin. Prat li'ilim shen yachal hagid. This comes to exclude a mute who's unable to go ahead and communicate. Right? So in other words, if someone is mute, but they know testimony on behalf of someone else, and they don't share that testimony, there is not biblical liability for such an individual. Gemara says, but 1 second. Rabbi Silber says, why not? Amai hayachal lahagi mitoch haksav. We just said that a mute person could communicate through writing. So why can't the mute person communicate his testimony through writing, and therefore failure to do so should result in biblical culpability? No. Testimony is different. Shiny edus terachmana amar mipihem v'lo mipik savam. I will say in general, interestingly enough, testimony is different. Why? In halacha, testimony can only be written. It can only be given verbally, cannot be given in a written form. So we'll say fascinating. So basically, Marez Zakasha, Kishem Shebotkin Oso le Gittin, Kach Botkin Oso le Ma'asos ul Matanos, le Edios ul Yerushos. So we'll say the same way that if the husband can't speak, right, if the husband is mute, so ultimately again we check him for capacity before giving a get. So in the same way we go ahead and we check him le Ma'asos for business dealings, Lematanos for gift giving, Le'edios for testimony, or the Yerushos, and for matters of inheritance. I will say, so what do you see from here? Katani miha, Edios. We'll say, if you look at this list, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, if a person is mute, we check their capacity for testimonial purposes, which sounds like, I will say, how is a mute person giving testimony? How is a mute person giving testimony? In writing. So you see from here, you can give testimony in writing. To which the Gemara says, Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yosef, Bar Minyuni, Amar Rav Sheshes, Be'edus Isha, Da'akilu Barabanan. But I will say, in general, we will not accept testimony from a mute person, not because a mute person doesn't have capacity, but rather, again, because a mute person can't verbally communicate testimony, and testimony cannot be given in writing. The only time we would allow written testimony is where? In the case of testifying on behalf of a woman that her husband died. We'll say we see in general that Mishumi Guna, in order to prevent an Aguna situation, Chazal totally relaxed the criteria for testimony when it comes to what we call Eidos Isha, testifying on behalf of a woman that her husband has died. So too again we would allow written testimony in that situation as well. V'hakatani Yerushos, but I will say in that same list it said that we'll accept the testimony of the mute when it comes to matters of inheritance. And I will say again, matters of inheritance is legitimate testimony. Rabbi Avo, Yerushas b'no habachar. We'll say very interesting. When do we say that we accept this testimony? Ultimately, again, when it comes to testimony regarding the inheritance of his own firstborn. In other words, that if the mute, right, if the person who is mute wants to go ahead and alter the Yerusha of his firstborn son, that he's believed to do. In other words, he could submit that in writing, and we will alter accordingly. Right? So we'll say, and that's different. Why is that different? That's his own affairs. So when it comes to his own affairs, okay, we'll accept the testimony. Katani mihas l'masuos l'matanos. But we'll say, it says that we accept this testimony for business dealings and for the giving of gifts. My love la'alma, isn't that referring to legal matters which impact other people? So you see from here that we accept the testimony of someone who is mute even in writing. Lo lididei. I would say rather again, this refers to matters which impact him, his own gifts, his own business dealings. Okay, so Meisvei, the Gemara is another kasha. Cheresh lo halchu bo achar mizosav va'achar kifitzosav va'achar ksav yado. Well, so when it comes to a cheresh, I will say now. Remember again, in general, cheresh means what? Deaf mute. When it comes to a cheresh, we do not go ahead and listen or pay attention to his remizos. So I will say, we don't. So remember again, his remiza is a gesture. Va'achar kifitzosov. And we'll say kifitzos means his mouthing of things, right? So we don't go after his gestures, his mouthing of things. Va'achar ksav yado, or after his handwriting. Elo b'metaltalin. The only time we'll go ahead and we'll take into account any of these gestures, whatever he's mouthing, or ultimately again his writing, is only when it comes to movable property, avalo Gittin. But we will not go ahead and follow after any of these things for Gittin. So we'll say, this directly contradicts Rav Kahana in the name of Rav. Remember, we'll both say, first line on the top of the daf. What did Rav Kahana say in the name of Rav? That a cheresh who is unable to speak, what is he able to do? He's able to convey written instructions, and we write a get based on his written instructions. So Rav Kahana said in the name of Rav that even a person who is a cheresh is able to divorce his wife through writing. Here Rabbi say the Bais explicitly says that although we will go ahead and accept writing, and when it comes to movable property, we will not accept writing vis-a-vis Gittin, to which the Gemara says, you're right. Tonight, in reality, this whole thing is a machlokes tanoim. It's a machlokes tanoim. When is this true? The chirish meikaro. This is actually very interesting. When is all of this true? This is talking about someone who was born a chirish. Right? Now, both say, when is what true? When is the statement that either gesturing, right, or going ahead and mouthing instructions or writing instructions will be invalid to allow for the writing of a get? When won't that work? That's talking about someone who was born a cheresh. Born a cheresh. Avol, bikeach v'nischarish. But I will say, if somebody was fully functioning, and then what? And then became a cheresh, hu kosev v'hein chosmin. We'll say, in that case, written instructions are valid. Right? Written instructions will absolutely help. So we'll say, this is a fascinating distinction that is being made over here. Right? Rabbi Shmuel Silber is saying, what does it depend on? When did you become a cheresh? If you were born a cheresh, remember again, we've seen this throughout our journeys in Shas. I will say this is actually again, you should just know, I've mentioned this in the past. This happens to be a fascinating discussion in contemporary halacha. Remember again, I will say, Chazal looked at a cheresh as a shota, right? Why? Because if you were deaf and if you were mute, you had no way to learn anything. Right? I will say, Baruch Hashem, we live in such a different time, where because of sign language, right, and multiple other techniques, ultimately, again, even a person who is deaf and mute has the ability to develop incredible das. But again, we're operating from the Gemara's construct that Allah Chamaisa, a person who is born a cheresh is a shota, has no capacity. So such a person like that, whatever they gesture, or whatever they mouth, or whatever they write, is halachically irrelevant, because the assumption is they lack das. Masha'en kain, a person who is a pikeach, who is born an original state of pikchos, full capacity, and then becomes a cheresh, what they write ultimately, again, will have an impact, because the assumption is they possess das. That's incredible, I will say. To which the Gemara says, is that true? Someone who's born a cheresh, ultimately, again, doesn't have the ability to convey das, or doesn't have the ability to convey intent through writing or any other way. To which the Gemara says, what about kushim shekonsa beremiza, kach motziyeh beremiza? So I will say this is very interesting. It's very interesting. So remember again, halacha l'maisa, a cheresh can marry a woman through gesturing. Right? In other words, he could affect kiddushin, so to speak. Now remember again, this is, can you imagine, by the way, like, if it was misinterpreted, right? He was like, I just want a cup of coffee, right? Meanwhile, again, somehow, again, they wind up married. But Lemaisa, the point over here is, however that remiza is done, ultimately, again, he has the ability to affect marriage through remiza. And I was saying, obviously, this is rabbinic marriage. Right? Chazal created the construct of rabbinic marriage that can be affected even without full capacity. So, kashem shu konsa beremiza, kach motziyeh beremiza. But the same way the marriage is affected through remiza, it can be dissolved through remiza. Right? So, Gemara says, I bi ishto. So, kashem shu konsa beremiza, kach motziyeh beremiza. To which the Gemara says, you're right. So, what do you see from here? You see from here, I will say that even in a case of cheresh me'ikaro, right, where a person is born a cheresh, there is the ability to go ahead and affect a get, or affect some type of divorce through remiza, right, through gesturing, right, or through mouthing, or through writing. To which the Gemara says, you're right. To To which the Gemara says, Ibi ishto, if you're talking about his wife, hachanami, then you would be correct. Hachamai Haskin is very interesting. What's the case over here? Biyavimto. Rabbi say the Cheresh ultimately again lost his brother. The brother died without children, and now the Cheresh has a Yibum situation in front of him. To which the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this. Miman. Right? Miman. Who is the Yibam falling to him from? If the brother, right? So we'll say now again, if the brother who died was also a Cheresh, we'll say that means that halacha l'maisa, the deceased brother's marriage was also beremiza. If the first brother's marriage is also beremiza, then what? Then Yibum / Chalitza should be affected through remiza as well. Rather, it has to be a case of where the deceased brother was a pikeach. So I will say, so this represents an interesting case. So if you can imagine, the deceased brother was a pikeach, which means his marriage was a legitimate marriage. Now again, he dies without children. His wife falls to his brother, who is a cheresh. So now I will say, the problem is you have a person who lacks capacity dealing with a relationship that, technically speaking, is a biblical one. Ugzera achiv cheresh. Atu achiv pikeach. And I will say what we would do is halach l'maisa, we would preclude a cheresh brother from doing yibum with a cheresh sister-in-law, right, who came from a cheresh marriage, lest he come to try to do yibum in a situation of yibam who felt him from a normative marriage. Because I will say again, the normative marriage situation, yibum cannot be affected at all. So Gemara says, ihachi ishto nami. If that's the case, why don't we go to just in a regular case of marriage, say you can't get married? Yivimto biyavimto michlafa, ishto biyavimto lo michlafa. We'll say one could confuse one case of yibum with another case of yibum, but one doesn't confuse a case of marriage with another case of marriage. So we'll say, so this is really quite interesting, to which the Gemara says over here, that halacha l'maisa, as much as a surviving brother who's a cheresh could affect yibum with a sister-in-law who felt him from being married to a brother who was a cheresh as well, what you can't do is a situation of a healthy brother married to a regular woman who died without children, and now ultimately again she falls even to a cheresh brother. That's a case that can't really be done, because he has an inability to affect a biblical relationship because he is a cheresh. Therefore, we will preclude him from doing yibum even with a cheresh sister-in-law or a sister-in-law from a cheresh marriage, lest he come to do yibum with her from a biblical marriage. Okay? So are we really gozer like this? The Gemara Migazrin and cheresh atu pikeach. Vatzman will say Amud Beis. Ayin Aleph Amud Beis 71b. Vatzman we learned Shnei Achin. Interesting case here. Shnei Achin charash nesu and Shnei Achayos pekos. If two cheresh brothers married two typical sisters, O Shtei Achayos charashos, or two cheresh brothers married two cheresh sisters, O Shtei Achayos, or two sisters, Achas pikachos va'achas charashas. One is typical and one is a charashas. V'chein shtei achayos charashos, or two sisters who are charashos. Nesuos l'shnei achin pikhin, ultimately married two typical brothers. Okay. Oh, l'shnei achin charashin, or to two brothers who are charashin. Oh, l'shnei achin echad bikeach v'echad cheresh, or to two brothers, one is a bikeach, one is a cheresh. I will say, bottom line, what is the halach in all of these cases? Hare elu peturos min hachalitza min hayibum. I will say, because there is a fundamental lack of capacity in these cases, therefore what? In all of these cases, the surviving sister-in-law, the surviving wife, right, the widow, ultimately again is pater from chalitza and from yibum. However, I will say the reason they are is because you can remember, without going through all of the cases, it becomes a case of tzara sachoso, right? It's of tzara. It becomes remember back to our Yibum, I know, back to our Yivamis days, and no one wants to go back there. Right? But remember again, I will say, one of the interesting ways in which, if it turns out that the co-wife is the wrong word, if the widow is an erva to an already existing wife, then what? There is no Yibum and there is no Chalitza. So I will say in all of these cases, the surviving widow the widow, right, who is subject to Yibum, essentially becomes an erva to the already existing wife. Therefore, again, there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza. But if the wives were unrelated, Yikansu. Ultimately, again, there could be Yibum. And if you want to divorce them, you can divorce them. So I'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, we do allow a cheresh yavam to go ahead and do yibum with a chareshes yavama. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Ella nechavarte kedishaninan meikara. Gemara says, let's go back to our original interpretation, and therefore we'll say the original interpretation is that we're talking about a case of where the brother who passed away was a pikeach, was fully functioning, and that's why the cheresh brother can't do yibum, because he could only affect rabbinic marriage at most, and therefore again he can't affect biblical yibum with his surviving sister-in-law. Fine. So I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows: Chalukin alav chaver of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's friends disagreed with her. We'll say again, what did Rabbi Shimon Gamliel say? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel wanted to make this suggestion, or we'll say that when do we say that a cheresh doesn't have capacity? When is that? That's cheresh me'ikaro. That is a person who was born a cheresh. But if a person was born fully functioning, right, and halacha l'maisa, and then he becomes a cheresh, he does have das, and he could go ahead and divorce his wife in writing. Or when we say divorce his wife in writing, in other words, he could issue written instructions, and based on those written instructions, ultimately, again, he has the ability to divorce his wife. So now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's friends disagreed with him. Amra Bai, Afan and Amitin, and we also learned, Nishtatis, if ultimately lo yotzi, we'll say, we're reversing this now. What happens if the woman becomes a shota? Right? Reuben's married to Rachel. Rachel unfortunately loses capacity. So what's the halacha? He should not divorce her. So I will say, so ultimately, again, now this is actually interesting, that halacha l'maisa, in a case of nishtatis, Chazal legislated that a husband can't divorce his wife. Why? We're concerned that she will not know how to take care of herself or guard herself against people's immoral advances. So to safeguard her, Chazal said you can't divorce her if she becomes nishtatis. Nischareshu, o nishtata. We'll say, what happens if he becomes a cheresh? Or ultimately, again, he loses capacity. Lo yotzi olamis. Ultimately, again, he can't divorce her. So I will say the pashtus, why is that? Because he lacks capacity. Right? Obviously, if he lacks capacity, I will say the chiddush is in the case of where she loses capacity. Why? Because since a woman could be divorced against her will, that seems to indicate to us what? That she doesn't require what? She doesn't require what? Das. If she doesn't require das, then even if she becomes a shota, that you should be able to go ahead and divorce her, which is technically correct. It's just that there's a rabbinic injunction against doing that to safeguard the woman, right? On the conversely, if he becomes a shota or he becomes a cheresh, he cannot divorce her at all. Olamis, forever. Why? Because he lacks das. So he says, my olamis. What does olamis mean? Lav afagav yochal dar mitoch haksav. We will say, does that not mean even though he could communicate in writing, right? He still can't divorce her. In other words, we'll say, this is the case we're talking about over here. Ruvain gets married. He's a fully functioning guy. Something happens. He becomes a cheresh. So we'll say, so now let's even assume, by the way, let's go with the typical definition of cheresh, that what does it mean? Deaf and mute. But I will say, but remember again, this is a different kind of case, because once upon a time, he possessed capacity. So now what does he do? He takes out a piece of paper, he writes on it, I, Ruvain, the son of Yaakov, who lives in Pikesville, wants to divorce his wife, Rachel, right, the daughter of Avraham. I want Levi and Yehuda to be my... He writes out the whole entire thing. So the Gemara seems to say, it doesn't work. Now, boss, and I remember again, that directly contradicts Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. To which the Gemara says, are we not saying, even though we can communicate in writing, we still do not accept this? Amra Papa, no. Ilav da'ashmo'inan Rabbi Yochanan. I'm sorry. Ilav da'ashmo'inan Rabbi Yochanan. Hava amin Rabbi Shimon Gamliel ferushe de Tanakama hu da'asa. I will say, were it not for Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation, I would have thought that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is simply coming to explain the Tanakama. How so? Umay olamis. What does it mean when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says olamis? What does it mean when the Bais says olamis? Af agav de chazina le de charif. I will say, I might have thought that even though we see that a person is charif, is sharp, ultimately, again, that is not enough to portray das. but maybe through writing should be enough. Inami, the other possibility is Rabbi Yitzchak, Devar Torah, Shota Miskareshes, Midi Dahavia Pikis Bal Karcha. We'll say, I would have thought, we saw before, there may be a Chareshes, a woman who is a Chareshes, ultimately, again, or I should say a Shota, should be able to get divorced. You should be able to divorce her. Why? Because we will say she's no different than a fully functioning woman who doesn't want to get divorced. Or as we just said before, clearly a woman does not require das to get divorced because you could divorce her against her will. So we'll say, so why did Chazal say that you cannot divorce a woman who is a shota? We'll say, as we said before, it's for a totally unrelated reason. We're concerned that if you divorce a shota, what's going to happen? People are going to take advantage of her. So to safeguard her, Chazal said you can't divorce your wife who is a shota. But Allah Lamaisa will say, technically speaking, it works. So we'll say, that's the end of the sugya. So we'll say, so what do we do? What do we do? Now we'll say, what we're left with is the following situation. Obviously, again, I will say, where a person doesn't have any kind of das, so obviously he can't divorce his wife. I will say, what you see from here is the case of Rav and the case of Shimon of a person, specifically, I will say, a person who is presently a cheresh, but perhaps at one point in time was fully functioning. He's able to communicate to us through writing or through gesturing. Is that enough to allow for the writing of a get? That's the fundamental shaila. So I will say, so the Rambam Paskins in Hilchos Gerushin, Perek Beis Halacha Tezayin. Here's the case. I will say, here's the case. Right? Mishin ishtatek. And I will say, the first case is someone who can't speak. So this is the case of the Mishnah. V'hari daito nechona, v'amru nichtov get le'ishtecha, v'herchin barosha, bolkin also shalosh pamim v'sirigin, im amar lahem alav, lava hein hare el yichtavu v'yitnu. So I will say, so case number one is the case of the husband who becomes mute. So that's really a pretty straightforward case. That's the Mishnah. What do we do if he becomes mute? Essentially, we'll say, we check for capacity. How do you check for capacity? A staggered series of yes and no questions. If he's able to score 100, right, on those questions, ultimately, again, I will say, because they're straightforward questions, it's not exactly like, a train travels due east at 40 miles an hour, right? Another train, that's not the kind of questions we're asking over here. We're like, do you want a piece of watermelon in February? So we're asking him straightforward capacity questions, right? We stagger them yes and no. If he answers them correctly, he has das, we correct the get. Fine. Then we'll say, in Halacha Yud Zayin, this is the more complicated case. What happens? Mishrasa kishupikeach v'nischarish. So we'll say, this is where things get complicated. So that's case one, he becomes mute, no problem. Unfortunately, but what do? Check for capacity, right? If capacity is established, and then he writes to write a get for his wife, can be done. Case two, Reuven marries Rachel, totally fine. So we'll say, then what happens over the course of marriage? He becomes a cheresh. Deaf and mute. What's talacha? Or for that matter, a shota, eno motzi li olam achi yavri. Now let's say, he cannot effect divorce. Until again he is healed from his charashos. Ve'ein somchin al remizas hacheresh. We do not rely on his gesturing. Velo al ksavo. Nor do we rely on his writing. Afa pisha daito nechonim yusheves alav. So I will say, salach lamaisa. It's just the way Chazal structured it, that because the cheresh lacks capacity, anything, so I will say, essentially what the Gemara is saying is like this: cheresh is a state of being. And in that state of being, Chazal said, you do not have das. But he's writing, he's gesturing. Essentially, in halacha, is going to be considered to be irrelevant. So this is really a fascinating case. Obviously, it goes without saying that contemporarily, there is much written on this case. So again, it's an interesting topic in general about how Chazal, we'll say, same thing, by the way, with shota. We'll say, what's a shota? A shota is a person who exhibits erratic behaviors, right? Remember again, shota is a definition. What's the definition of a shota? Person who tears his clothing, goes to sleep in the cemetery. So I will say, so today, we understand from a mental health perspective, a person could exhibit erratic behaviors right? And can have a mental health diagnosis, but still have capacity. So again, we're not getting into the contemporary piece, we're just doing the Rambam. So I'll say, from the Rambam's perspective, once you are a cheresh, even though you are coming from a state of being where you had capacity, when you are in the state of charashus, you lack the ability to write a get. You lack the ability to commission a get, even though you're gesturing, even though you're mouthing, and even though you're writing explicit instructions. Incredible. Mishnah. Abrulo nichtav get leishtecha. If they say to a guy, right, people go over to Reuben and say, Reuben, do you want us to write a get for your wife? V'amar lahen ksovu. And he says, yeah, write it. Write it. And I will say, they go ahead. So let's say, imagine for a moment, Reuben says this to A and B, right? A and B, we'll just call them A and B. A and B come over to Reuben. Reuben, we see things are not going well with you and Rachel. Do you want us to write a get? Reuben says, write it. And A and B then go, Amru l'sofer kasav, u'le'edim v'chasmu. So we'll say, so what happens? We'll say, essentially, if you can imagine over here, A and B, they're carving out like a business niche, right? Right? What do? Right? They try to create turnkey get solutions, right? Turnkey get solutions, LLC. Right? So they see Reuben has a major fight with his wife. They say, Reuben, things aren't looking good, right? So you know what? Let us help you. Let us help you through this. Let us help you through this. So ultimately, again, you want us to write a get? He says yes. They say no problem. We'll take it from here. They go ahead. They engage the sofer. They engage the witnesses. They have a whole get. So Rabbi says, so what happens? So Rabbi say, what do A and B do? A and B deliver a fully written and signed get. They give it back to Reuven. Give back to Reuven. And now Reuven gives it to Rachel. Because of Nasnallah, Harei get batal. Rabbi say, so this get is void. Rabbi say, why is it void? Why is it void? Because the Mishnah is introducing us to the idea that in order for a get to be valid, not only does it have to be written with the husband's consent, but the husband has to be the one who engages the sofer and the witnesses. Because in this case, he engaged neither the sofer nor the witnesses, therefore Allah said the get is batal. To which the Gemara says, Time is Allah Amar Tnu. Now I will say, sounds like the reason ultimately, again, the get is not valid is because Reuven just said to A and B, kiss, will write it. He didn't say tnu. He didn't say give it. In other words, we'll say, had he said tnu, perhaps tnu would have given them control over the process, to outsource. To which the Gemara says, money. So whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? Rabbi Meir, the Amar Mili Mimshon L'Shliach. We'll say, it's glad to remember again, we learned this sugya. This must reflect the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir will say, holds that agency could be assigned. So had Reuven said tnu, kisvu tnu, he would have given them complete ownership over the process and would also give them the right to assign the agency to others. Ema Sefer, but look at the end of the Mishnah. Ad shiyomer l'sofer ksov u'le'edim chasamu. Asan Rabbi Yossi. What does the end of the Mishnah say? The end of the Mishnah says the get is only going to be valid when? Only if Reuven directly contracts the sofer and directly contracts the edim. Who does that go according to? Asan Rabbi Yossi, Damar Mili Lo Memshon L'Shliach. That reflects Rabbi Yossi's view. What's Rabbi Yossi's view? Agency cannot be assigned. To which the Gemara says, Reisha Rabbi Meir v'Sefer Rabbi Yossi. I found that in the beginning of the Mishnah reflects Rabbi Meir. The end of the Mishnah reflects Rabbi Yossi in Reisha Rabbi Meir, Sefer Rabbi Yossi. Yeah, that's what you have to say. The beginning of the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Meir, that agency can be assigned, and the end of the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Yossi, that agency cannot be assigned. Also, we'll stop over here for today. We'll see two more interpretations of the Mishnah Meir Tashem in tomorrow's daf. We'll say, Shkoyach.